Deep inside the digital archives of one of the most advanced technology companies on the planet lies a fragmented piece of video footage that has completely baffled federal investigators. It is not the visual content of the video that has paralyzed the behavioral analysis unit of UT, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, but rather the invisible code buried beneath the surface. Experts call it metadata. It is the digital footprint that records exactly when and where a file was created. But in this highly secure system designed to protect homes and provide absolute certainty, the metadata was scrambled. The timestamps were violently torn apart. The system could not tell the authorities if the masked figure staring into the lens was recorded on the 11th of January or the 31st of January. This was no simple computer glitch. It was a deliberate and surgical manipulation of cloud-based security infrastructure. Someone had bypassed the very technology designed to keep intruders out, and they did it so effectively that the top digital forensic experts in the country were left staring at a blank screen. How does an unknown figure walk up to a residential security camera and completely erase their digital footprint from the servers of a global tech giant? What kind of specialized knowledge is required to not just evade a camera, but to weaponize its own data against the people investigating a crime? These are the questions keeping federal agents awake at night as they sift through layers of corrupted code. What do you think the federal agents really found in that corrupted metadata? Drop your theories down below, and if you want to dive deeper into the concrete evidence behind unsolved mysteries, make sure to subscribe to Crime Files with Liam. The digital silence left behind by this intruder is deafening, and it points to a level of sophistication rarely seen in domestic investigations. We are not looking at a crime of passion or a random act of violence. We are looking at a highly coordinated operation, executed by individuals who understand the architecture of modern surveillance better than the people who built it. They knew exactly where the blind spots were, and they knew exactly how to exploit them. The manipulation of the timestamp was the first clue that this investigation would require tearing apart the digital fabric of a smart home to find a ghost. The Catalina Foothills of Tucson, Arizona present a striking contrast between rugged desert terrain and sprawling, isolated luxury. It is a place where wealthy residents rely heavily on advanced security systems to guard their expansive properties. For 84-year-old Nancy Guthrie, this isolation was a daily reality. Nancy lived alone in a large house situated in this quiet residential enclave. She was an elderly woman with significant physical vulnerabilities. Nancy required the assistance of a god pacemaker to keep her heart beating steadily, and she experienced noticeable difficulties with her mobility. Walking was not a simple task for her, and navigating the large, empty spaces of her home required effort. Yet, despite her frail condition, she remained in this vast property entirely by herself. The anomaly in her lifestyle was her absolute reliance on the invisible digital shield surrounding her home. Instead of physical security personnel or living with relatives, she trusted the glowing lenses of smart cameras to keep the outside world at bay. She believed that the constant stream of data uploading to the internet would act as an impenetrable barrier against any physical threat. This absolute faith in technology over human proximity created a dangerous vulnerability. The cameras could watch, but they could not intervene if someone crossed the threshold. On the evening of January 31st, 2026, the reality of her isolation became starkly apparent. Nancy had spent the evening having dinner, and she was returning to the quiet solitude of her Foothills estate. She was accompanied by her son-in-law, Tommaso Cioni. They did not drive their own vehicle, but instead relied on a rideshare service. They requested an Uber to bring them back to the dark residential street. The dashboard camera inside the Uber vehicle recorded the entire journey. It captured the mundane reality of a typical ride home. There were no heated arguments, no signs of distress, and absolutely no indication that they were being followed through the winding desert roads. The footage from the rideshare vehicle was completely ordinary. At exactly 9:50 in the evening, the vehicle pulled up to the residence. The dark desert sky blanketed the property as Tommaso ensured Nancy was safely dropped off at her home. The Uber pulled away, leaving the 84-year-old woman alone with her smart cameras and her pacemaker. The glowing taillights of the vehicle disappeared down the street, fading into the blackness of the Arizona night. Silence returned to the Catalina Foothills property. The heavy wooden doors of the house were closed, shutting out the cold desert air. Inside the house, there were no sounds of forced entry. There was no shattering glass, no alarms, ringing out into the neighborhood, and no signs of a struggle echoing through the empty rooms. There was only the quiet hum of electronic devices communicating with distant servers. The security system was supposed to be watching every angle of the property, but the digital eyes were silently failing. The physical isolation of the house, combined with the invisible technological blind spots, created a perfect trap. As the clock ticked past 10 in the evening, the illusion of safety began to unravel. The impenetrable digital fortress was nothing more than a fragile glass house waiting to be shattered. The desert was quiet, but it was not empty. Something was already there, waiting in the spaces where the cameras could not see. The darkness swallowed the property completely. Whoever was watching knew exactly how long it would take for the house to settle into a deep slumber. The absolute stillness of the night was the most terrifying warning sign of all. The morning of February 1st, 2026, arrived with the typical bright Arizona sun illuminating the rugged landscape of the foothills. It was a Sunday morning, a day built entirely around routine and predictability for Nancy Guthrie. Every Sunday she had a strict schedule that anchored her week. She was a regular attendee of her local church services. Because of her mobility issues and physical limitations, she did not travel to the physical building. Instead, she relied on her internet connection to participate. She would log into the online portal to stream the church service directly into her living room. It was a digital routine that her family knew well. But as the morning progressed, a distinct and troubling break in the pattern occurred. The digital log showing the attendees for the online service did not register her presence. Nancy never logged into the system. She did not connect to the stream. The virtual seat remained completely empty. This was the first undeniable fracture in the normal timeline of her life. For an 84-year-old woman living alone, a broken routine is not just an oversight, it is a blaring alarm. The concern among her family members escalated rapidly as the morning hours slipped away. Between 11 in the morning and 12 in the afternoon, the family made the decision to physically check on her well-being. They drove up the winding roads of the Catalina Foothills, approaching the sprawling property that was supposed to be her safe haven. When they arrived, the atmosphere was immediately unsettling. The exterior of the house looked completely undisturbed. The windows were intact. The doors showed no signs of being violently forced open. But there was no answer from inside. The family was forced to break the door to gain entry to the residence. What they found inside was a terrifying vacuum. The large, empty spaces of the house were completely silent. Nancy Guthrie was nowhere to be found. Her belongings appeared to be in order, but the 84-year-old woman had simply vanished from the locked house. They immediately dialed 911. The dispatcher sent local police units rushing to the scene. When the officers from the Pima County authorities arrived, they began to secure the perimeter and scan for any immediate physical evidence. Because there were no broken windows and no splintered door frames, the initial assessment was confusing. How does a woman with severe mobility issues disappear from a secure home without a trace? The answer began to reveal itself, not inside the house, but just outside the front door. As investigators meticulously examined the exterior walkway, they discovered something that shattered any hope of a simple misunderstanding. There were distinct stains on the porch. It was not a massive pool, but the red droplets were undeniable against the surface of the entryway. The forensic team carefully swabbed the stains and secured the samples for immediate testing. The scientific analysis of those droplets would later provide a chilling confirmation. The red stains on the porch were absolutely confirmed to be the blood of Nancy Guthrie. Her genetic material was left behind on the concrete exactly where she would have walked to. Enter her home. The blood evidence fundamentally changed the nature of the investigation. This was no longer a case of a confused elderly woman wandering away from her property. It was a verified crime scene. But the physical evidence stopped right there on the porch. There was no drag mark trailing off into the desert. There was no discarded weapon lying in the brush. There was only the blood on the concrete, and the terrifying realization that someone had been standing on that porch with her. The local authorities were staring at a locked house, a missing woman, and a small trace of biological evidence with absolutely no physical trail to follow. What happened between the time the rideshare vehicle drove away at 9:50 the previous night and the moment the family broke through the door? Who could bypass the advanced security system, extract an elderly woman without alerting the neighbors, and vanish into the night, leaving only a few drops of blood behind? For 10 agonizing days, the investigation seemed completely paralyzed by the lack of physical clues. The local authorities hit a brick wall, but behind closed doors, the Federal Bureau of Investigation was actively tearing apart the digital fabric of the smart home system. On February 10, 2026, the silence was finally broken. The federal agency released a piece of evidence that sent shockwaves through the community and fundamentally shifted the entire narrative of the case. They had managed to extract and decrypt a fragment of video from the doorbell security camera. The footage did not show a confused neighbor or a random local burglar looking for quick cash. It revealed a highly organized and terrifying presence. The video showed a figure stepping directly into the frame of the camera. The person was completely covered from head to toe, leaving absolutely no skin exposed to the digital lens. They wore a thick mask that obscured every facial feature. Federal analysts studied the physical proportions of the individual in the footage and estimated their height to be exactly between 5'9" and 5'10". But it was the equipment the intruder carried that transformed the case from a simple missing persons investigation into a hunt for a tactical operator. Strapped securely to the back of the masked figure was a specific brand of gear. It was a black Ozark Trail Hiker backpack with a precise capacity of 25 liters. This was not a standard school bag. It was a piece of equipment designed for sustained movement and carrying heavy loads. Even more chilling than the backpack was what the investigators spotted resting against the side of the intruder. Clearly visible in the decrypted footage was a sidearm holster. This individual did not come to the property empty-handed. They came armed, prepared for a violent confrontation, and completely aware of their surroundings. The most disturbing part of the video was not just the physical appearance of the masked figure. It was their precise behavior. The intruder did not flinch when they approached the camera. They did not try to hide their face behind a hand or turn away from the lens. Instead, the footage showed the masked figure reaching directly toward the device. They actively and intentionally tampered with the security hardware. They knew exactly where the camera was mounted, exactly what its field of vision covered, and exactly how to physically compromise its recording capabilities. The footage ended with the chilling image of the masked individual, staring straight through the digital eye right before the signal was violently terminated. This was the exact moment the investigators realized the horrifying truth of the situation. This was not a spontaneous crime of opportunity. This was a calculated, targeted extraction of an 84-year-old woman. The level of preparation, the specific gear, the weapon, and the absolute confidence in disabling the security system pointed to a professional operation. Take a very close look at the precise way the intruder carries that 25-liter backpack and the specific positioning of the weapon holster. Do you notice any distinct military or tactical characteristics in their movement and gear? Drop your observations in the comments, because sometimes the smallest visual detail breaks a case wide open. The realization that a heavily armed tactical intruder was standing on the porch of an elderly woman was paralyzing. The local police were completely out of their depth. The physical evidence was gone. The digital evidence was actively fighting back against the forensic teams. The masked figure in the video was a ghost who had successfully bypassed every layer of security meant to protect the victim. The authorities now knew exactly what the monster looked like, but they were no closer to finding out where he took her or who he was working with. The chilling revelation of the masked tactical intruder immediately forced a harsh spotlight onto the initial steps of the investigation. When a crime scene involves a professional operation, every single grain of dirt and every microscopic fiber becomes a critical lifeline. But the authorities leading the charge in the first crucial hours made a devastating miscalculation. The Pima County law enforcement response was initially directed by Sheriff Chris Nanos. Under his command, the deputies processed the sprawling Foothills property. They secured the small amount of blood evidence on the concrete porch, but then they made a decision that would haunt the entire investigation. They released the crime scene entirely too early. Instead of holding the perimeter for days to allow advanced forensic teams to meticulously comb through the dust, the landscaping, and the interior walls, local authorities cleared the area. This rapid release of the physical environment effectively destroyed any chance of recovering subtle biological clues. Any latent fingerprints left on the exterior gates, any shoe impressions pressed into the desert soil, and any trace DNA left behind in the struggle were lost to the wind and the elements. The physical environment was hopelessly compromised. This catastrophic failure at the local level forced the Federal Bureau of Investigation to completely abandon traditional physical evidence collection. The federal agents had to pivot their entire strategy. If the physical world was scrubbed clean, they had to hunt the masked intruder in the digital realm. The federal agency deployed their specialized cyber response teams to dive deep into the invisible architecture of the smart home. They moved past the standard video logs and began tearing apart the intricate layers of background code. Former federal spy-defation agents analyzing the case noted that the investigation had to drop down into Tier 3 and Tier 4 digital data. This is the deeply hidden forensic information that exists beneath the user interface. It includes the pinging of internet, routers, the handshake protocols between the camera and the cloud servers, and the exact microsecond delays in signal transmission. The investigators were looking for the digital shadow of the intruder, but they were not dealing with an amateur who simply forgot to clear their search history. They were hunting an operative who knew exactly how the digital security infrastructure was built. The scrambled timestamp from the video footage was not just a lucky break for the criminal. It was a deliberate deployment of technical countermeasures. The federal cyber analysts realized that the intruder had intentionally corrupted the communication stream between the physical camera lens and the storage servers. They were fighting an enemy who understood exactly how to erase themselves from the digital record. The frustrating reality of the investigation was setting in. They had the video of the masked man with the 25-liter backpack, but they could not mathematically prove exactly when he was standing there. The corrupted metadata was a massive roadblock. The authorities were staring at the data packets, trying to piece together a puzzle that the suspect had intentionally smashed into 1,000 pieces. The destruction of the physical crime scene by the local authorities meant that there was absolutely no physical backup plan. There was no smoking gun left in the dirt to cross-reference with the broken digital code. The federal agents were walking a tightrope without a net. They had to reconstruct the timeline using only the fragmented, corrupted data left behind by a technical expert. Every day that passed without a clear timeline meant the trail of the 84-year-old woman was growing colder. The technological battle happening behind the scenes was intense. The behavioral analysis unit was attempting to build a psychological profile of an attacker whose only defining trait was absolute digital supremacy. This was not a standard abduction. This was a clash between the highest levels of federal cyber, forensics, and a ghost who knew exactly how to dismantle the modern illusion of absolute security. The investigators knew that if they could just crack the corrupted metadata, they could rebuild the timeline of the attack. But the complex layers of code were tightly locked, and the clock was mercilessly ticking forward. The absence of physical clues left the authorities staring into the digital void, hoping to find a single mistake, a single line of code that the masked intruder had forgotten to erase. The pressure on the federal cyber teams was unimaginable. They were working around the clock, analyzing the complex server logs provided by the technology companies. They understood that finding the exact original date of the corrupted video file was the only way to track the movements of the tactical operator. Their entire case depended solely on the invisible code. The investigation was already drowning in complex technical puzzles when an entirely new layer of chaos erupted, threatening to derail the entire federal operation. The son-in-law and the biological daughter of the missing woman suddenly began receiving chilling communications on their personal cellular devices. These were not vague threats, but highly specific ransom demands, claiming direct responsibility for the abduction. The messages described a hostage situation and demanded immediate financial compensation for the safe return of the missing relative. For a brief, terrifying window of time, the authorities believed they had finally established a direct line of communication with the orchestrators of the crime. Federal resources were immediately diverted from the slow, painstaking process of digital forensics to the high-stakes arena of active hostage negotiation and signal tracking. The pressure was immense as tactical teams prepared for a potential exchange. However, the digital footprint of these text messages led the cyber tracking units down a deeply frustrating path. The signals did not originate from a secure burner phone moving through the local desert. Instead, the geographic routing data pointed directly to the state of California. Investigators executed a rapid operation and apprehended an individual who had absolutely zero connection to the physical extraction in Arizona. The entire ransom demand was exposed as a cruel, opportunistic hoax. A complete stranger had watched the news coverage of the high-profile disappearance and decided to exploit the immense suffering of the family for financial gain. The apprehension of the California suspect closed one door, but it opened a dangerous window of public suspicion that temporarily engulfed the victim's own relatives. The media frenzy surrounding the fake ransom demands cast a dark shadow over the son-in-law. Because he was the driver of the rideshare and the very last person confirmed to have seen her alive, public speculation reached a boiling point. The intense scrutiny forced the authorities to conduct an incredibly invasive examination of his life. Detectives executed search warrants to meticulously inspect his vehicle, looking for microscopic trace evidence, hidden compartments, or any lingering signs of a struggle that might have occurred after the rideshare departed. They audited his communication logs and his financial history, searching for a hidden motive. The agonizing process dragged on, but the results were ultimately definitive. Law enforcement officially cleared the son-in-law and the rest of the immediate family of any involvement. The vehicle searches yielded absolutely nothing. The financial audits were completely clean. The false leads and the cruel extortion attempt had cost the federal agents precious time, acting as massive red herrings that pulled their attention away from the core mystery. With the family officially ruled out, and the California imposter sitting in custody, the investigation slammed right back into the very same brick wall they had been staring at from the beginning. Every alternate theory had evaporated, leaving the agents alone once again with the corrupted server logs and the fragmented video file. The noise of the false ransom demands faded away, replacing the chaos with the cold, silent reality of the manipulated cloud data. The authorities realized that the answer was never going to come from a careless text message or a panicked phone call. The orchestrators of this operation were entirely too disciplined to make a mistake like that. The solution was locked away inside the timeline discrepancy. Why was there a massive, unexplainable gap between the 11th of the month and the night of the disappearance? What actually happened during that missing window of time? If you think you know how this extortion plot distracts from the real timeline, drop a like and share this video to support our deep dive into these incredibly complex case files. The federal agents knew they had to stop looking for a panicked kidnapper and start hunting a meticulous tactician. The focus narrowed intensely back to the digital anomaly. The behavioral analysts embedded within the federal teams began to look at the scrambled timecode, not as a technical failure, but as a psychological signature. They started to ask a fundamentally different question. What if the discrepancy was not an attempt to hide the crime after it happened, but rather a necessary step in preparing for it? This shift in perspective was about to crack the entire case wide open and reveal a level of premeditation that would terrify even the most seasoned investigators. The breakthrough did not come from a newly discovered fingerprint or a secret witness stepping out of the shadows. It came from the minds of the federal behavioral profilers who finally decoded the true meaning behind the broken server logs. When the top analysts examined the video fragment bearing the disputed date from early January, they realized they were not looking at a botched robbery. They were watching a highly sophisticated dress rehearsal. The individual captured on camera was conducting a physical penetration test of the property weeks before the actual strike. The profilers concluded that the masked operative had deliberately approached the lens on that specific date to probe the defensive capabilities of the smart home architecture. They were testing the response time of the system, mapping the exact dimensions of the visual blind spots, and confirming whether their civilian jamming equipment could successfully sever the connection to the cloud servers. The corrupted metadata was the direct result of this deliberate electronic interference. The operatives intentionally scrambled the temporal data to ensure that if the footage was ever recovered, it could never be accurately placed on a chronological timeline. This chilling revelation completely altered the scale of the investigation. The federal profilers issued a definitive and terrifying assessment. The individual standing on the porch was absolutely not operating alone. The level of operational security, the deployment of signal jammers, and the flawless execution of a physical extraction without triggering a single neighborhood alarm required a highly coordinated team. The analysts determined that this specific type of high-value target acquisition necessitates a minimum of 2 to 4 highly trained individuals working in perfect synchronization. The operation required a dedicated surveillance unit monitoring the neighborhood routines for weeks to establish the target patterns. It required a skilled driver keeping an extraction vehicle running silently in the absolute darkness. And it required a physical entry team capable of subduing the victim instantly without a struggle. The realization washed over the investigation like a wave of ice. This was a shadow network. A specialized criminal cell had quietly invaded the affluent desert. Community mapped the vulnerabilities of an isolated estate and executed a flawless timeline. The targeted resident had been placed under meticulous surveillance for an extended period. Every routine action, every medical appointment, and every evening trip had been cataloged and analyzed. She was targeted with the kind of precision usually reserved for corporate espionage or state-sponsored operations. The authorities were no longer simply looking for a missing person. They were hunting a ghost squad that could bypass modern digital security as easily as turning a key. This shattered the fundamental illusion of safety that defined the entire neighborhood. The residents believed their high-end cameras and constant cloud connections made them untouchable, but the profilers proved that these devices were merely tools that could be turned against their owners. The criminal team did not fear the lenses. They studied them. They used the cameras to calculate the exact optimal moment to strike. Tell me your thoughts in the comments below, because we have to ask why a highly organized, tactical syndicate would expend such massive resources and risk federal scrutiny to target a solitary, vulnerable individual. The sheer disproportion of the force used against such an unprotected resident is the most disturbing aspect of the entire profile. The operation was too perfect, too expensive, and too complex for a standard burglary. The profilers knew that criminal organizations do not deploy four-person teams and electronic warfare tactics without a massive guaranteed payout at the end of the line. The precision of the strike indicated a specific motive that remained entirely hidden from the authorities. The dry run in early January proved that they had infinite patience. They waited in the desert, watching the house sleep, knowing exactly when the digital shield would drop. The terrifying truth was that the victim never stood a chance. She was caught in a web woven by professionals who had already won the game before they ever stepped foot on the property. They dismantled the perimeter silently and efficiently. The behavioral unit outlined a scenario where the entry team moved through the compromised blind spots with absolute certainty. They knew the floor plan. They knew the limitations of the security network. The rehearsal had given them the exact blueprint for the abduction. The federal assessment left law enforcement staring at a horrifying reality, where technology was not a shield, but a weaponized vulnerability. The sprawling investigation has now settled into a grueling war of attrition. The immediate frenzy has faded, but the tireless hunt for answers continues behind the closed doors of federal cyber laboratories. The official status of the case remains agonizingly unresolved. The biological family and the son-in-law have been unequivocally removed from any suspicion, allowing them to grieve and search without the crushing weight of public accusation. Yet the massive void at the center of the case remains unchanged. The whereabouts of the victim are completely unknown. The authorities have not recovered any new physical traces in the vast expanses of the desert or within the borders of the state. The specialized teams are currently engaged in a massive undertaking, attempting to piece together the absolute final fragments of deeply buried server data provided by the technology company. They are hoping against all odds that a single uncorrupted line of code might reveal an internet protocol address, a geolocated ping, or a tiny digital breadcrumb left behind by the syndicate. But the passage of time is the greatest enemy of any investigation, and every passing month allows the trail to grow infinitely colder. The true horror of this case lies in the stark contrast between the physical reality of the extraction and the complete success of the digital manipulation. The operatives successfully erased their faces, their vehicles, and their communications from the modern world. They created a masterclass in technological evasion, leaving the best analysts in the nation chasing shadows through corrupted servers. The absence of traditional clues forces the entire weight of the justice system onto the shoulders of the technical division. The tactical team might have successfully blinded the smart home network, but the federal strategy relies on the belief that no electronic erasure is ever 100% perfect. There is always a microscopic anomaly, a fragment of background code that survives the purging process. The authorities guard their ongoing cyber discoveries fiercely, knowing it is the single strategic advantage they possess that the criminal cell cannot anticipate. If the electronic trail never fully materializes, the investigators will have to rely on the syndicate eventually, making a mistake in the physical world. The case stands as a chilling monument to the limitations of modern security. A wealthy, secure community was breached, not with brute force, but with sophisticated electronic countermeasures. The perpetrators walked away with their target and simply dissolved into the landscape, leaving an entire federal task force grappling with the invisible architecture of the internet. The silence from the syndicate is absolute. There are no new ransom demands, no leaked documents, and no whispers in the criminal underworld. The discipline of the operatives holding the victim is terrifyingly complete. They executed the mission and vanished, severing all ties to the community. The ongoing search efforts have expanded beyond local jurisdictions, relying on national databases to monitor for any matching financial or medical markers that might suddenly activate. The sheer lack of movement suggests the syndicate either transported the target far beyond state lines immediately after the resida extraction, or are utilizing an incredibly secure holding location that defies standard detection methods. Law enforcement continues to appeal to the public, but they are acutely aware that standard tips will not solve a puzzle designed by technical experts. They must find the microscopic flaw in the electronic armor worn by the attackers. Until that digital armor cracks, the desert winds will continue to sweep across the quiet property, guarding a secret that refuses to be uncovered by conventional means. The family waits in a state of suspended animation, hoping for a breakthrough. The psychological toll on the community is immeasurable. Neighbors who once felt invincible behind their electronic gates now understand the fragile nature of their protection. The realization that a highly organized element could operate so freely in their midst has fundamentally altered the atmosphere of the entire region. The Federal Bureau remains deeply committed to breaking the silence, pouring unprecedented resources into the technical deciphering process. They understand that solving this mystery is not just about finding one individual, but about neutralizing a sophisticated cell capable of striking anywhere. What this case teaches us about the rapid evolution of home invasion is profoundly disturbing and requires a fundamental shift in how we understand personal safety. We are witnessing the terrifying transition from mechanical lockpicking to the surgical exploitation of cloud-based architecture. The contemporary criminal has traded the crowbar for the civilian signal jammer. The absolute reliance on wireless home networks creates a dangerous psychological illusion of total security. Homeowners believe that a glowing light on a device equals guaranteed protection. However, this investigation definitively proves that standard wireless connections are incredibly fragile when confronted with targeted electronic interference. The modern tactical intruder does not need to break your door down if they can simply command your network to stop recording. They understand that a home disconnected from its storage server is completely blind. This is the new frontier of vulnerability, where the battleground is not the physical perimeter, but the invisible spectrum of radio frequencies surrounding your property. The tactical reality is that organized networks are studying consumer-grade technology specifically to identify and exploit these exact limitations. They are auditing the defensive capabilities of average citizens. As an analytical platform dedicated to dissecting the modern criminal mind, Crime Files with Liam will continue to expose these evolving methodologies. We must move beyond the basic recounting of events and rigorously examine the intersection of high-tech infrastructure and predatory behavior. The true crime landscape is shifting rapidly from physical forensics to digital warfare. Understanding these advanced exploitation tactics is no longer just an intellectual exercise. It is a critical necessity for comprehending how the next generation of organized crime operates in the shadows of our interconnected lives. Recognizing this technical shift is the only way to prepare for the threats of excavation tomorrow. The central mystery continues to haunt the empty halls of that desert estate. We are left staring at the most glaring, unanswered question of the entire investigation. What possible underlying motive could justify a highly resourced professional syndicate launching a complex electronic warfare campaign simply to extract an elderly resident from her quiet life? The sheer imbalance between the sophisticated methods deployed and the seemingly ordinary nature of the target suggests a deeply buried secret that the perpetrators were willing to risk everything to uncover. This operation was not a mistake. It was a calculated strike, driven by a purpose we cannot yet see. The next time you look up at the den-like 10 blinking lens mounted above your own front door, you need to ask yourself a very uncomfortable question. Is that device actively protecting your family, or is it quietly providing a patient observer with the exact mathematical equation they need to bypass your life? Hit the subscribe button and activate the notification bell to ensure you never miss the next deep dive. into the darkest corners of criminal architecture, right here on Crime Files with Liam.